Hello again, economics students. So let's continue looking at some SAC questions, breaking them down and giving you some confidence before you go into your first assessment. So we're looking at the next section along 1.2. We are looking at a SAC question on demand, the law of demand, and the demand curve. So here's the question. It's actually a past exam question that the 2021 economics cohort would have done in their exam. This question is another distinguished question, but it has two parts to it. So we're going to break down the parts first. First of all, we need to distinguish between a shift and a movement along the demand curve. So that's this section here. The second thing we need to do is use the axes below to illustrate a shift and a movement along the demand curve. Okay. The question's worth 4 marks, which means the first part, we're just going to split in two, which you can do a lot of the time, almost all the time. First part is worth 2 marks and the second part is worth 2 marks. Okay. Now in the last video we looked at what distinguish means as a task word. It means to show the difference between two concepts. But because there's only 2 marks on offer here, we can get away with just demonstrating an understanding of each concept. We could, if we wanted to, focus on the distinction, but I think it's easier just to define both or demonstrate an understanding of both concepts. So demonstrating an understanding of a shift and demonstrate an understanding of a movement along the curve. Then the next thing we need to do, our next task word here, is to illustrate, and of course that means to draw on a demand and supply diagram, or on a price and quantity axes. And we will have practiced this in class, but we need to illustrate or draw a shift for 1 mark and a movement along for 1 mark. Okay, so 1, 1, 1, 1. Let's make this easier. I've written them here. So 1 mark for demonstrating an understanding of the shift, an understanding of the movement along, and then 1 mark for drawing or illustrating each. I think that's pretty easy to break down the 4 marks there. So let's focus in on the first part here, the writing part. So on an exam, you'd have some lines, and then you'd have a price and quantity axes to illustrate, or you'd have 2 in fact. So let's think about the writing. To distinguish between, remember we need to first of all show an understanding of what it means to shift the demand curve. Okay, I've got a shift is when there's a change in quantity demanded at each price. But you could do it a number of different ways. You could say it's a change in the ability and willingness to consume at each price. You could say it's a change in the relationship between price and quantity. There's a number of different ways to demonstrate an understanding, but it needs to be probably one of those 3. Then a movement along the curve. Now this is when there is a movement or a change in the quantity demanded in response to a change in price. So it's sort of like a visual representation of the law of demand. Now this is probably enough for 2 marks. 2 mark questions are pretty easy to get full marks, but let's just make sure we get them. So what I'm going to do is add in here to the shift, I'm going to say, well, what causes a shift? It's pretty easy to know this, that it's a demand factor, and I can give any example. So in this case, a change in the price of a substitute will shift the demand curve. I don't think that's too hard to do. The second bit here you may not be up to already, but what causes a change in the market price and therefore a movement along the demand curve? Well, it's actually a shift in the supply curve. Okay, it's actually a shift in the supply curve that will change the price and move, or will cause a movement along the demand curve. You may not be up to this last bit yet, so don't worry if you're not. Okay, so we've definitely got 2 marks here. Let's think about the last 2 marks, which is to illustrate on an axis, a price and quantity axis. There we go. First of all, let's do the shift. So we've got our demand curve. Make sure it's downward sloping. Just check when price rises, quantity demanded decreases. It's definitely a demand curve. We have to shift it, so it doesn't matter which way, but we've shifted it I've shifted it to the right here. Make sure it's labeled properly. And oops, I probably should have drawn a little arrow to show that this is a shift to the right. And I probably should have even labeled this a shift, otherwise they might not know. Definitely have to do that, sorry. Then we have to show a movement along, and we've got a demand curve again, and I've shown a movement along the curve. If you wanted to get technical, you could draw in the supply curve. It's the shift in the supply curve that's going to cause the movement along the demand curve, or the contraction in this case. Or I probably should have drawn some dots here to show what's happening, that there's a decrease in quantity and an increase in price. However, there's only 1 mark for this and 1 mark for that, so these 2 will be enough as long as they were labeled correctly, as long as it said shift and movement along. Alright, hopefully that helped. See you in the next video. Bye for now.